No, it's interesting. Augustine speaks of desire. Another way of looking at this, although I can emphasize here that desiring God is a most wonderful way of conceptualizing the draw of the human person towards God. Augustine elsewhere says that we were made for God and that we are restless. We are restless without Him. So He puts our hearts at rest. That's why in the reading of the proverb today it talks about better to have little and have peace with God than to have much but be anxious. Another way of looking at this, particularly when he says that when we see God, we will have the fulfillment of our desire. We could also look at this through the lens of another power of the soul. Not just desire, not just will, but intellect. That the fulfillment of all the powers of the soul will find their place in the beatific vision, seeing God face to face. Exactly what that means and what that would be like, I do not know. But I do know that it is something that we desire, and we will be fulfilled when it happens. To see God as He is, somehow, in some way. I often speak about the conscience needing to be properly formed and the intellect needing to be properly informed so that both may be directed towards their natural end. And that end is the beatific vision. And only the pure in heart will see God. So, if there be any incompatibilities with God's love dwelling within our hearts, any contrariety, it needs to be extinguished. It needs to be taken seriously. Jesus once said that if your eye causes you to sin, or your right hand causes you to sin, whatever it is that might be leading us to sin, cut it off. It's better to enter the kingdom of heaven maimed than to have our whole selves lost and thrown into hell. He's using more of a hyperbolic language here, but what he means is that we ought to inconvenience ourselves, so to speak. Do whatever we can to avoid the near occasions of sin, and to get rid of anything that draws us away from properly disposing the soul to be receptive to the grace that God wants to give to us. That's how we become like Him. That's how we share in His holiness. That's how we participate in the divine nature, how we be renewed in holiness and true righteousness. Only then can we submit ourselves to God as a living sacrifice, pleasing and acceptable to Him. So, if anybody has any questions or thoughts or comments, definitely feel free to engage during discussion time. We certainly have another 15 minutes here or so before I finish up with night prayer. I know I have certainly been reflecting more upon things that may hinder spiritual progress. There's so many things that can hinder us. Sounds good, Savage. And sometimes having to give up good things in the pursuit of better things. Sometimes we think of the spiritual life as simply getting rid of sin, right? To working a vice out of our life. But the thing is, what is actually happening while vice is being worked out of our soul is that virtue is actually working it out and weeding it out. It's replacing it. It's not like there's a moment where the vice is completely gone and now we begin building the virtue. This is not how it works. As you are working on the virtue, the vice is becoming less and less. So as you are pursuing chastity or temperance or courage or whatever it may be, these virtues, these habits, just the nature of what a virtue is, excludes the vice. So when somebody's working on, say, chastity, and they're actually making progress, they're developing chastity, they wouldn't be more and more falling into immorality, certain sins. Rather, we would see that occur less and less through the pursuit of virtue. So when we think about weeding out vice, what we're really working on is, how do I love God more? To love the Lord God with all our heart, soul, strength, and our neighbor as ourself. This love of God that's shed abroad in the heart by the Holy Spirit, whom He has given to us. This love is what purifies and perfects the heart. And as we've talked about before, we're looking at this through the paradigm of a father and a child. We look to God as a father, which really unique to Christianity is that that God the Son has revealed to us that God is not just a father that in the sense that He created everything or that He made man, but that it's part of His nature, right? It's part of what God is. God is a father because He has a divine Son from all eternity. And so He reveals this to us. That's why He says that no one can come to the Father but through me, because if you don't recognize me as the divine Son, you cannot know God as Father. You might know Him conceptually by some other means, but certainly not through the lens of a father. Jesus says that, if we want to enter the kingdom of heaven, we have to become like children. We have to become reliant upon God. We have to look to Him as a father. And so it is natural for a son to love their father, to want to become like their father. Hey, Trudeau's, welcome in. So what Augustine said in our reading today is, yes, we're gonna labor, we're gonna work hard, and we're gonna try to weed out the weeds, right? We're gonna, in his analogy, we're gonna stretch our capacity for love, right? So that, yes, our hearts have been filled with the quality of divine love, but it can also grow in greater capacity. I don't remember what saint it was, but someone said something to the effect that, when you come to the ocean of God's love, you're going to bring a bucket or you're going to bring a thimble. It may have been reference to something else, but that is the image of disposing ourselves to be receptive. And also in our first reading, it was talking about the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. One thing that is, I think, lost on our culture is that it's driven by things that have no concern for God whatsoever. And that is unfortunate, because as our eyes are taken off from our natural end, which is ultimately what will bring us happiness, those eyes are drifting to created things, even to the point where there's a complete denial of the Creator altogether. And so all they have to look to are created things. And they are not satisfying. We always keep coming back to them. But we desire something that will satisfy us, that would be unlike these things. That's why Jesus talks about living water. We can keep going to the water faucet and we keep drinking every time we get thirsty, but we keep getting thirsty, But spiritually, God will meet our spiritual needs. Give us living water that will satisfy us. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, I shall give you rest. My yoke is easy, my burden is light." When people don't have God to go to, they're more prone to fall into addiction. When we don't have God to trust, and we may act inappropriately and irresponsibly. So having an appropriate response to God, I think, kind of sets the human heart straight. Because there's somebody other than ourselves that we're responsible for. Hey Nick, welcome in. I mean, I certainly get the the concern that some people might have philosophically that, if you grow up with the notion, or your parents had drilled it into one's mind, that the idea of God is just a way of controlling humanity, and what's the use anyways, because we just make God in our own image and just project whatever ideas and concepts we want onto him, the same way that people would take the word love and just project whatever it is, that meaning or definition they want to give to it. Like God becomes like an empty concept which one just colors and fills and constructs all on their own. A Bishop Barron lecture from 2020 basically talking about this very point. It's a valid concern, because even people who are Catholic or Christian who are thinking about the idea, or have been presented with the ideas, or trying to live according to the church's teachings, still get it wrong and on different points and stuff. So, and they're living out of that too. And there are some parents who take the position that, even teaching your kids about God at all is simply abusive. But obviously that's coming from an atheistic worldview. Oh, okay, that's probably why I haven't seen it yet, but... Yeah, so, I think two things happen. One is a person doesn't want to be controlled by somebody else's ideas. That's the way it's being processed. So either I'm going to conform myself to ideas that you have about this God concept, or I'm going to construct a God concept of my own making. And both are wrong. While a person can, to one degree or another, properly communicate things that God has revealed, either generally, where God is to be discovered by reason. And that's not to say there isn't any subjectivity involved. There's nothing wrong with having an emotional response that is appropriate to God's revelation. That there is an appropriate response to God. Like when we come to him in repentance, it's not the man who justifies himself and boasts and is arrogant. He doesn't see his faults. He has the inability to make himself vulnerable before God, because he has the inability to make himself vulnerable to himself, to see himself as he is. But I get the tendency in either case, whether or not we are resisting a construct that exists in the mind of another, or whether we demand a construct of our own, we're both doing something to control what the construct is. And that's the thing, that whatever God is not something that we project upon him at all. I mean, we can speak of him with anthropomorphisms. We can, use analogies. We can use the way of negation. God isn't this book. We can use we could say that in some sense this participating in the being of God held together by his power reflects something of his glory. So I think even people who, in constructing their own ideas, sometimes the anthropomorphisms can run amok to the point where they're like, oh, well, God's just a glorified man or something like that. And there's some people who drift into that. Normally it's driven by a fundamentalist, a literalistic reading of Scripture that does violence to the text and doesn't treat the text appropriately. But I think that kind of that also is influenced by the dictation theory of inspiration, which I don't find to be helpful. So people have that tendency. But people who've spent, a reasonable amount of time reflecting on these sorts of things, and I think being honest with oneself about one's ignorance about certain things or what their tendencies are, because even when we approach this question, there's tendencies, I mean, because there are conceptions of God in the minds of some that I would say, yes, definitely stay away from them. They're going to lead you astray, I mean, just think, 5 years from now, strapping a bomb to your chest and taking out a bunch of people. There's people who will use the idea of God to justify things that run counter to our sensibilities. And there's so many ways that people can twist these things, and I look at that, the Holy Grail, like my point. Even the Christian who properly recognizes God as Father may not, sometimes because of father wounds. All right, we could have father wounds where we were neglected, we were abandoned, we were beaten. So our concept of God, you can call it the kind of a feeling concept. I know that's really strange language, but that's kind of how I first thought about it. I was reading about it, and that's the way it was explained. I could think in my mind that God is loving, but in woundedness, though, woundedness is often an emotional problem, needing an emotional, and we end up looking at God through the lens of emotion. We feel that God has abandoned us. So I think that God has abandoned us. But I do not think yet as I ought to think. I do not yet know as I ought to know. But I think, like with our culture, we see these two extremes: either a complete and absolute denial, or a complete and absolute perversion of God. Exactly, Nick. Exactly. In Christian theology, God wasn't under necessity to create. The concept is that of divine conservation. We exist even now in this instance because God actively, in this moment, I'm not speaking temporally of God, I'm speaking temporally of us. We exist in this moment because God wills it to be so. If God were, as Nick says, to withdraw himself, withdraw his power from us, we would just slip right back into the nothingness from which we came. We were created ex nihilo, from nothing. So divine conservation is him conserving us in existence. This says something to us when we look at this from this point of view. God, who is a necessary being, wasn't under necessity to create anything contingent. Right? Existence is something we receive. God is existence by nature. And we're not going to get into whether or not something can be predicated to God. In God, his essence and existence are identical. It is his very nature to exist. I'll put it that way. Perhaps that's better language. I think Aquinas would be more pleased. But it tells us something about God. That even in this moment, he wants us to exist. He wants us to exist right now. And he's not doing it begrudgingly, like he feels like he has to. Certainly wasn't a mistake. We can't really posit any sort of change to God or imperfection, or he would cease to be what we know to be God, the highest which the human mind can possibly conceive. But I find it interesting that when we actually use reason to dive into something that is everyday, simple stuff, just looking at things and reasoning from it, that in this moment, God is holding this together. It's really neat to ponder that. And the hustle bustle of life, doing this, doing that, to sit down and just muse over something for a moment and just ponder it. You know, I think our culture has no patience for pondering, no patience for taking the time to reason through something. People seem to be more driven by emotion, insatiable, impetuous, desiring instant gratification. Just striving to fulfill our basest passions. Never taking the time. Now, of course, it's using overstatement here. And, you know, there has to be somebody out there who, I don't really think there's an actual person who never has had any glimpses, moments of flashes, instances where they have a flash of inspiration or revelation. Imagine having an ego so huge and warped that you think you can be what you want and do what you like, and it's all nothing to do with anyone else. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, that kind of reminds me of the difference between liberty and licentiousness. You know, that distinction. You know, people who conceptualize liberty as being able to do anything that you want, but that's not liberty, because as soon as you engage in vice, yeah, you wanted that, but now vice enslaves the will. So you're not. You know, that's not a. That's a. That's a method to destroy the. It's a principle. It just whittles away at its own principle. Rather, you know, the idea in in Catholic theology is that the human will is more free under the operation of grace. Virtue is actually what frees the will, and therefore is what leads us to happiness, natural happiness, for one way of putting it here, or eternal happiness, eventually in the beatific vision. So the do what I like is problematic. It's misguided. People talking about rights, but never taking much concern for responsibility. I think I remember seeing that. Wasn't that Will from PragerU? He was doing that. He asked somebody that question. And the idea, okay, so we talked about the liberty and licentiousness distinction. The other thing you said, that you can be whatever you want. You know, normally when we're asked that question, we're thinking of like, what do I want to go to college for? Well, Muck, you must respect. You must respect Nick. Yeah, that's right. Not only do you have to acknowledge his self-identification, you have to act accordingly. And if you don't, you're a bigot. Yes. This is rooted in what I've shared before. One of the axioms, one of the axioms of existentialism is that existence precedes essence, which is a reversal of what Catholic theology would frame this. And that is, essence precedes existence. That a thing is what it is in and of itself, that gives form, right? Gives form to the whatness or the isness of the thing. And then the thing exists according to that isness or nature. right? So existence is the state of being that thing that it is. And what it is its essence, its isness. It's like a cat, right? A cat's essence is catness, not Katniss Everdeen, but catness or dogness. And then the existence that proceeds from this is a cat doing things that a cat does. It acts according to its nature. It's doing what is natural, what is according to its nature. In existentialism, they rather posit the axiom that existence precedes essence. And so what they start with, philosophically, is this base existence, that you exist. It kind of reminds me of the Descartes, I think, therefore I am. It's the, I can reject, deny everything, right? It's like the ruthless criticism of all that exists. We're just going to throw it out. The one thing I cannot deny is this pondering mind that I have here. That I am. I am. I exist. I exist. This exists. From that immediacy, if I can say that, an immediacy of consciousness, we proceed to essence. We shape and mold and define everything. Instead of it being a thing outside of us, right? It is what it is, regardless if there's a mind around to conceive it. Kind of reminds me the opposite of that being the nominalists who say that, this is only what we can construct in our mind that this thing is. And so really all we can do is project intellectual constructs onto everything. And that we can't really see what a thing is in itself. We can't see a thing as it is in itself. We're going into Kant here. We can't. There's just the pneuma, what it is, and then there's the phenomena, how a thing appears to me. Some might go as far as saying that there's a reciprocal relationship between reality pressing itself, reasserting itself. And this happens, and Kant wasn't completely wrong in this instance, that the human mind does receive impressions from reality, like impressions. An impression would be like a signet ring on warm wax. It presses itself upon us. It asserts itself. And it's good because some people have really bad ideologies that they need to be confronted with reality. Because 5 bullet points on a restaurant napkin just doesn't cut it for interpreting and understanding reality. But I wouldn't reduce it to some kind of mysterious thing where we are so skeptical of all the things, of everything, right? We're just skeptical of everything all the time. And it's been said that skepticism only has utility in as much as it leads to conviction. It needs to take you somewhere. It needs to do something. All right. There is a workplace in Australia that last week said any of their employees who identifies as trans can have a 6-week paid vacation. So one of the employees told them he was a trans woman who thought she was a trans man, and he deserved 12 vacations by default. Get my mind through these intellectual hoops here. What's going on in that? The going further down the rabbit hole there, Monk. They are difficult to discuss casually because there are forces out there that do not want us to reason. They just want us to. They don't want intellectual integrity. They want ideological conformity. They don't even want to discuss certain topics. And I've attempted in different ways to try, and although I'm very careful to do this because you need to be careful adopting the language of an opposing philosophy, because the language has philosophical baggage, right? They're infused with certain concepts and definitions. So I always advise against adopting the language of opposing. Now, one thing that I've done before is try to use that language in a way to show that anybody can use the language that they're using. Like I've said both of these things in videos before, that like some people like to use the word bigot. Well, I could label people anti-religious bigots, or I could label them Catholic phobes. Some of you've heard me use those phrases before. I don't really find that rhetoric to be helpful. Another thing I once explained, taking the approach of a postmodernist for a moment, let's put that cap on, that we can construct. All right, we could just construct reality in our mind. We can have our own conception that we impose upon reality when it comes to the nature of the self. So we do this in the identitarian approach to the person, right? So human emancipation. Yes, I think that's a good term. Yeah. Connection between Marxism and assuming progressivism is identical with human emancipation. Yes. Yes, it's a freedom from the tyranny of everything. So, birds, not birds, so like bees can be fish now, I'm being facetious there. I know that's not exactly what that means. But I once said, listen, I've said this, all right, so you and I, on opposing, have opposing views, conflicting intellectual commitments. All right. The philosophy of man, how we interpret and understand nature, how do we categorize things, right, are different. So we have different language, right? So different terms and different definitions, different concepts altogether with which we view the human person. People who are being indoctrinated are constantly immersing themselves in it. They're constantly getting the messaging. They're interacting with it on Twitter. They're just constantly immersing themselves in it. Now, everything I just said could be said of me. Okay? And I would say this. I said, listen, so you want me to be respectful, that you're a thinking, reasoning human being. You're trying to figure it all out. You're trying to make sense of everything. And you, for the time being, have found these concepts to be more helpful to you and making sense and interpreting reality. Right? I get that. I get that. Now, I would say if one has constructed their identity based on those concepts, those terms, those definitions, using that language, understand that there are people who construct their identity using a different set of concepts, terms, definitions, and language. Right? And in doing so, can often lead to people in direct conflict. So I said this. I said, okay, so how about this? I identify as a hylomorphic being. All right. I am a material body, and I have an immaterial, immortal soul. I'm created in the image and likeness of God. By nature, that is what I am. That's what I am. Do not erase my identity, right? Do not engage in identity erasure. That's my identity. That's how I understand myself. And not just understand myself, but that's what I think is reality. No. No, thanks, Nick. I appreciate that. So the thing is okay. So if that's how I identify, all right, this high hylomorphic being, that's how I identify that I was created by the Christian God, I'm not going to demand from somebody to accept that identity. Once again, I'm using language I don't normally use because I don't find it useful. I do not find it helpful. Particularly because I go out of my way to make sure that I do not adopt the phraseology of an opposing worldview. I do not find it helpful. Like, and I've gotten to the point where I don't even use the word gender anymore. I just don't use the term. Because two things. Historically, the term gender has been used colloquially as an interchangeable term with sex. And legally, because we can see them used interchangeably on legal documents for like forever. and that language is gendered. I don't have any use for the word gender outside of that. Everything else is categorized differently, and I like sometimes what people mean by gender, they mean personality, or they mean mood, or they mean the tendency for someone to be more or less masculine or feminine, or temperament. It's become like an umbrella term, really, that has kind of subsumed within itself all these different concepts that were categorized on its own apart from that term. So the term has become expanded. And it was a slow development from people using the term gender role, right? And then moving to gender expression, and then moving to gender identity. You could see how it just begins to move, and the term begins to just expand. I have no use for the term. I understand other people might want to use it and define it however they want to define it. But, controlling words, controlling mind, right? I don't have to adapt the language and concepts from opposing worldviews. I don't have to do that. All human conflict comes down to theology. People having a different philosophical anthropology. How do we interpret nature? They order the language to make certain ideas impossible. To make certain ideas. What's interesting is one time I was on Twitter. Somebody didn't like that somebody said something that they didn't like. And I said, you're on social media. People can say all kinds of things. And they said to me, how can you allow them to do that? Like, what? How can you allow them to do that? I'm like, I have no power over this person. I don't allow or disallow. It has nothing to do with me. They just exert their will. All right? They're created in the image and likeness of God. They have a will too. That's one of the powers of their soul. They can direct that will in various directions. It's just, I had no idea how to think of the term. Like, what do you mean? Why is that even a thing? I have no power over the power of somebody else's soul. I don't have any power over their will. Unless what they mean by that is, unfortunately, that they wanted me to ostracize people for having an idea in their mind that may or may not be different than my own. There is such a thing as intellectual diversity. There are people who think differently than me and you. Some people think the craziest stuff. Some people are really down to earth. Comes out of a couple hundred years of philosophy leading to the French postmodernists in the 1970s declaring everything as a social construct and as a power game. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of somebody taking something and then making it everything. All right, they take an aspect of academia, something that you can think, oh, okay, this culture is different than this culture. There are different cultural expectations. They have different food, dress. This is human expression, right? Like different foods, different dress, uh, the different food, dress, music, all kinds of different stuff that are just various cultural expressions of human nature. But then you also have like the relationship of one person to another, within and without family, and one's relationship to or the nature of government and our relationship to it, right? You have those things that are going on. But what happens is somebody will take something like race, for instance, right? And they'll create an entire study or worldview lens through which people look at stuff. That's what the critical race theory stuff is. That's why you can't teach mathematics without doing story problems that are teaching you something about a certain aspect of social justice, so-called. Bishop Barron did a video. I don't remember what he did, but I watched it a while ago, where he was talking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he said, "Well, I'll just speak. These, don't be afraid of these terms. Just because somebody's using these terms, and I purposely avoid those terms right now, because how they seems to be predominantly being used. So I'll be very easily misconstrued. It's difficult to use them in a context where somebody's not drawing how it seems to be culturally or predominantly used culture. And when I say predominantly, I don't even mean everybody or even a majority, but it just seems to be a very strong concept that's pressed upon us. So I try to avoid that language. Like, I don't like using the word identity anymore. I want to be able to creatively explain my Catholic faith to the world in a way that doesn't use language that is typical, because I'm not interested in adapting the culture. I'm interested in confronting the culture with Catholic teaching. I had a point and I drifted away with it. Oh yeah, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bishop Barron said that these are okay virtues, but they're secondary virtues. And he gave an example of not everybody could be in an NBA basketball team. I mean, there is inequity there, and there's supposed to be, because it's competitive. So and you can't include everybody in it. Some people will be excluded. That's what makes it competitive. Is that competition is exclusionary by nature. But he says these virtues, and they are virtues, seeking. I don't think that one person should be treated poorly than another. Impartiality, for example. These principles are very deeply rooted in Scripture. That we all need to be treated with dignity, right? But normally, when I say treat a person with dignity, I mean treat them as one made in the image and likeness of God. And what I mean by in the image and likeness of God, I mean one who has a immaterial, eternal soul that has powers of will and intellect and bear the image of God. Not what people necessarily think of themselves. For some reason, people think that in order to give dignity to you, I'll have to come back to these virtues. Don't let me forget the DEI. Don't let me forget to come back to that. Some people think that the only way to give dignity to another human person is to dignify things that they feel and think and perceive that are undignifiable. You see the distinctions, right? Why teach math? That's right. Oh, have you guys seen that that Daily Wire video? What is a woman? I watched that a few nights ago, and Matt Walsh was talking to a professor at a college, and Matt Walsh used the word truth. He used the word truth, and the professor got mad at him, saying that he's using that word and it's arrogant. And you can see where he's coming from. If all there is my truth, and there isn't the truth that is something outside of ourselves to which we all must conform, you see? He's like, well, that's arrogant. Right? But yeah, it's a couple of the people that he interviewed either walked out or threatened to walk out of the conversation, which I thought was unfortunate. Even if Matt Walsh's face, just his face, you can even if you think he's being condescending or tricky with his language or whatnot, he's expressing a real valid concern and frustration that some people have. All right, to go back to the so I talked about the distinction of dignity and dignifying, not dignifying those things that are undignifiable. There's the diversity, equity, and inclusion that are secondary virtues that some have attempted to make primary virtues, and to consider them in a vacuum, not in relation to other virtues, and certainly not couched in primary virtues such as love. Okay, love. What is love? It's not defined love as love. No, love, by definition, all right, is God. We can say that God is love. Right? We say that God is love. But love is to will the good of the other. Is to will the good of the other. There are things that are objectively bad for somebody. And I would be culpable if I were to attempt to influence or lead a person in a way that's not good for them. It's good. Yeah, right. If it's good to prevent suffering, then why doesn't God just annihilate existence? Because people don't look at suffering right. I mean, in Catholic theology, anyways, suffering was one of the tools through which humanity was saved. Through human suffering, it had redemptive purpose to it. And so it's said that Christ infused suffering with redemptive value. So even our own sufferings, we never suffer needlessly, because suffering is always redemptive when we approach it with a disposition of holy resignation and allow God to use it to shape and mold our heart. Which brings us back to what we were saying earlier, that we need to properly dispose ourselves for God. So yes, virtues need to, there's the 3 theological virtues, so called because they have God as their, I want to say, source and telos. That they have God as their object or subject. They have God as their subject. That the hope, faith, and love are directed towards Him. It's how we relate with Him, through his own gifts, through His own righteousness. Not righteous as God is in Himself, but that He makes us righteous. Oh, that's a distinction of Trent. Yeah, I smuggled that in there. You're welcome. They take something that would be false in a context and isolate it so you don't have a standard to say it is false. Yeah. All right. I need to transition. We had a good discussion, kind of floated all over the place. I wasn't really expecting to have a lot of thoughts.